You guys know Brian Shaw, the 6'8" giant strongman with the personality of a rock soaked in glitter, Eddie Hall's best friend and occasional lover, and one of the most decorated strength athletes of all time. 4-time world's strongest man, 10-time podium finisher, creator of his own strongman competition, which he of course also won, and even after retirement still one of the largest humans to ever legally exist. At his biggest, Brian weighed in at over 200 kilos, or 441 pounds, aka my bench max, and somehow, because his build was also weirdly proportional, he filled out that frame perfectly, which made him pretty good at any event in strongman. On top of that, he was also very smart with his training, avoiding stupid career-ending injuries and mistakes, and he managed to stick around longer than Mark Felix can hold up 2 pillars. But, in my eyes, Brian Shaw was actually the most impressive early on, back in his early 20s, when he had barely even started strongman. Now, Brian grew up in Colorado, over in the United States of cheeseburgers, born to 2 fairly normal-sized humans. His dad being about 6 foot or 183 centimeters and his mom being around 5'11". So whatever the hell they fed this kid to turn him into this in a few years should be a video on its own. Interestingly enough though, Brian never actually planned on doing strongman. Instead, he wanted to play basketball. He wanted to be the next LeBron James, or perhaps more realistically, the next Shaq. But by the time he entered high school, Brian was already 6'6" and close to 250 pounds or 120 kilos. Imagine for a second you're heading to class on the first day of school and the first guy you see looks like the real-life Shrek wearing a backpack. Jokes aside, Brian played basketball throughout high school and even into college, where he eventually got himself a bachelor's degree in wellness management, which probably didn't hurt him when it came to understanding training, recovery, and how to function as a large human being. But during this period, something changed. Even though Brian had been lifting weights alongside basketball and some football, he was never really that strong. He was just really big. But once he started taking lifting seriously, things escalated fast. He blew past the 300-pound bodyweight mark and just kept going. And in the same year he finished his college degree, he entered his first ever strongman competition after being nudged by a few guys at his local gym. At this point, Brian was fully grown at 6'8" and weighed over 350 pounds and had never practiced strongman events. But he won that competition anyway. At 23 years old, Brian showed up bigger than everyone else, stronger than everyone else, and instantly became an elite at the amateur level. What's even crazier is that he went pro and actually started qualifying for high-level shows within a year. And just 3 years into the sport, Brian made his first ever World's Strongest Man appearance. And that's when people realized that, hey, this isn't just another big guy. In his very first World's Strongest Man appearance, Brian went head-to-head with the reigning champion Mariusz Pudzianowski from Poland, perhaps the most dominant strongman the sport had ever seen. And despite being a complete novice by comparison, Brian came uncomfortably close to beating him. That alone told everyone exactly what type of problem Brian Shaw was going to become. Now, many people argue that Brian Shaw's era was the most competitive era in strongman history, and honestly, it's very hard to disagree. He competed against Big Z, against Thor, Eddie Hall, against Pudzianowski, all overlapping, and all of them in their primes. So when Brian won his first World's Strongest Man title in 2011, he wasn't some lucky newcomer. He had already been on the podium twice, and had turned himself into one of the most complete strongmen the sport had ever seen. In fact, if we're talking about completeness, I don't think anyone comes really close, because in 2011, Brian did something absurd. He broke the strongman deadlift world record 3 times in a single competition while wearing sweatpants, and the same year he won the Arnold Strongman Classic, meaning he was simultaneously the world's strongest man, the Arnold Classic champion, and the deadlift world record holder. No one else has ever done that before or since. And keep in mind, this was before strongmen were heavily specializing for the deadlift, because the equipped powerlifting world record at the time was held by Andy Bolton and was actually a bit higher. But Brian was the first guy to really do everything. And after 2011, he entered what I like to call his orc arc. Brian shaved his head, he put on even more weight, and turned into a walking violation. At his heaviest, he reportedly weighed around 450 pounds or 205 kilos. He towered over everyone, except maybe one other large Icelandic problem.
Nice.
And became brutally strong across the board. Atlas stones, farmer's walks, yokes, pressing, pulling, you name it. The only events he didn't dominate were the fast running ones, and even then he still usually placed in the top 5. Honestly, his biggest weakness at that point was probably his massive bald head getting sunburnt during competitions. What really separated Brian Shaw from everyone else though wasn't just his peak strength, it was his consistency. He didn't fluctuate wildly in body weight, he didn't chase some side records, and he didn't sacrifice competition performance for single lift glory like Eddie Hall or Hafthor Bjornsson. He just showed up every year, did everything right, and placed near the top every single year, year after year. And that's why he also holds the record for the most consecutive World's Strongest Man finals and the most top 5 finishes in the sport history. Eventually though, age caught up with Bryan. Events got faster, strongman shifted towards speed and explosiveness rather than just pure strength and power, and being a 450-pound man with a family, a business, a spine that had carried refrigerators for decades finally became a disadvantage. Bryan's placings slowly started dropping, even outside of the top 5 before the end of his career. But even then, he wasn't done. In 2021, at 39 years old, Bryan made one last serious run at a 5th World's Strongest Man title, and he finished second. Unfortunately, that 5th title never happened, but the fact that he was still there at that age says everything. And when you look back at his career, some of Bryan's feats still sound fake. For one, he deadlifted 486 kilos with a torn bicep in 2012, he squatted 700 pounds for 13 reps in 2017, only losing the event because he ran out of time. He also won the world's heaviest yoke ever used in competition, walking with 710 kilos on his back, and perhaps my favorite feat, he pinched 2 45-pound steel plates with a single hand. A feat only a handful of humans have ever done, and he just does it casually on TV. Oh, of course, and throwing a keg so high that it came back down and almost hit him in the head. I'm pretty sure the keg never fully recovered. And of course, who could forget the one time Eddie Hall threw a medicine ball directly into Bryan's face? The only time where I've seen this man genuinely angry.
Hey, little help!
Had that been a normal human, they would be in the ICU, but Bryan just looked annoyed. Now, even though Bryan Shaw never won his 5th World's Strongest Man title, he retired in the most Bryan Shaw way possible, by winning the Strongest Man on Earth show on the day of his retirement, beating the reigning World's Strongest Man Mitchell Hooper, and reminding everyone that Bryan was still very much of a problem. Bryan Shaw was never the flashiest strongman, he wasn't the most explosive, he was never the most specialized, he was just the most reliable expression of strength the sport has ever seen. And in a sport built on extremes, injuries, and very short careers for the most part, that might be the most impressive feat of all, competing at the highest level for close to 15 years. And even today, while arm wrestling at a malnourished 375 pounds, Bryan is still proving the same point that he always has. If you show up strong, prepared, and consistent for long enough, eventually the sport will have no choice but to bend around you, especially if you have your own gravitational field. But what do you guys think? Is Bryan Shaw the most complete strongman and perhaps strength athlete of all time? Would he have won his 5th title if he wasn't competing against guys like peak Eddie Hall and peak Hafthor Bjornsson? And do you think he will succeed in the sport of arm wrestling? Let me know down below in the comments what you guys think, and as always, I'll see you all next time.